On the morning of April 14, 1847, in the heart of Louisiana's plantation country, a wealthy landowner named Henri Laval presented his wife with an anniversary gift that would destroy 3 lives forever. The gift was wrapped not in paper, but in a simple cotton dress. A 12-year-old girl named Rose purchased from a neighboring estate for $200. What Madame Laval didn't know, what the household staff whispered about in the quarters after dark, what the ledgers and letters hidden in Henri's study would eventually reveal, was that Rose carried his blood. She was his daughter. For 15 years, this secret festered in the grand halls of Bellemont House, poisoning everything it touched, until the truth emerged in a way that shocked even a society accustomed to unspeakable cruelties. The records were burned, the witnesses silenced, and the official story buried beneath layers of respectability. But some truths refused to stay hidden. Before we continue with the story of the Laval family and the girl who became the center of their unraveling, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below telling me what state or city you're in. Now let's step back to where this tragedy truly began, more than a decade before that fateful anniversary morning. The story of Rose Laval, though she would never be permitted to use that surname, began not in Louisiana, but on a smaller plantation in Mississippi in 1835. Her mother, a woman named Dinah, worked in the house of the Mercier family, where Henri Laval was a frequent guest during his years as a young bachelor, building his fortune in cotton speculation. Dinah was known for her skill with needlework and her quiet dignity, qualities that made her valuable to the household and unfortunately visible to Henri. Henri Laval had arrived in Mississippi in 1833 at the age of 28, with ambitions that far exceeded his modest inheritance. His family had been minor merchants in New Orleans, respectable enough but not wealthy, not connected to the old Creole aristocracy that still dominated Louisiana society. Henri understood that in the expanding cotton economy of the 1830s, fortunes could be made quickly by men willing to take risks and work without the constraints of old money's cautious conservatism. The Mercier plantation, Belle Rive, was one of several properties where Henri conducted business during those early years. He bought cotton futures, arranged shipping contracts, and cultivated relationships with the planters who would become his pathway to wealth and social advancement. Old Monsieur Mercier, a widower whose own sons had died of yellow fever, seemed to appreciate Henri's energy and business acumen. Henri became a regular guest at Belle Rive, sometimes staying for weeks at a time during the busy harvest seasons. It was during one of these extended visits in the summer of 1834 that Henri first truly noticed Dinah. She was 23 years old, had been born on the Mercier property, and had worked in the house since childhood. Her mother had been a skilled seamstress, and Dinah had inherited that talent along with a grace and intelligence that set her apart. She could read. Madame Mercier, before her death, had taught several of the house slaves their letters, a practice that was technically illegal but quietly tolerated in many households. What happened between Henri and Dinah was never recorded in any letter or diary, never spoken of in polite company. But those who worked at Belle Rive during that period would later remember seeing them together in the sewing room, where Dinah worked on the household's linens, and Henri would sometimes appear with questions about fabric orders or household accounts. They would remember the way Henri looked at Dinah, and the way she would lower her eyes, but not before something passed between them that was more than the usual dynamic between master and slave. The relationship, if it could be called that, lasted through the fall of 1834. Henri was young, far from home, and operating in a world where white men's access to enslaved women was simply an accepted reality, rarely questioned and never punished. Dinah had no power to refuse, no protection, no choice. Whether there was any genuine feeling between them, or whether it was simply another exercise of power disguised as romance, is impossible to know. What is certain is that by December of 1834, Dinah knew she was pregnant. She told no one at first. In a world where enslaved women's bodies were not their own, Pregnancy was always complicated. It could mean increased value as a potential mother of more slaves, or it could mean punishment if the father was white, and the situation threatened to become publicly awkward. Dinah watched and waited, trying to gauge what Henry's reaction would be, whether he would acknowledge any responsibility or simply disappear back to New Orleans and leave her to face the consequences alone. Henry left Belle Reve in January of 1835, returning to New Orleans for the social season. He did not come back to Mississippi that spring. Whether he knew about Dinah's pregnancy before he left, or whether he simply moved on to other business opportunities and other plantations, the records don't say. But by the time Rose was born in August of 1835, Henri Laval was already courting Celeste Dufresne in New Orleans, already building the respectable life that would eventually lead to his marriage and establishment as a prominent planter. Dinah gave birth to Rose in the quarters at Belle Reve, attended by the other enslaved women who served as midwives and nurses. The baby was lighter skinned than her mother, with features that would become more pronounced as she grew. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the way she held her head. To anyone who had known Henri Laval, the resemblance would eventually become unmistakable. Old Monsieur Mercier was not a cruel man by the standards of his time and place, but he was practical. He understood what Rose's existence meant, understood the delicate situation it created. He also understood that Henri Laval was becoming an increasingly important business connection, a young man on his way to significant wealth and influence. So Monsieur Mercier made a decision. Dinah and her daughter would remain at Belle Reve, would be well treated, and the matter would not be discussed. It was a solution that maintained everyone's dignity, or at least the appearance of it. Rose grew up in the quarters at Belle Reve, learning to work alongside her mother. She was a bright child, quick to learn, and Dinah taught her everything she knew about sewing and household management. But Dinah also taught her daughter something else: how to be invisible, how to keep her eyes down and her thoughts hidden, how to survive in a world that saw her as property. These were lessons that would serve Rose well in the years to come, though they could not protect her from everything. Henri Laval visited Belle Reve occasionally during Rose's childhood, though less frequently than in his bachelor years. He was married now, established at his own plantation in Louisiana, focused on building his cotton empire. But when he did visit, he would sometimes see Rose, a child playing in the yard, or helping her mother carry linens, or standing quietly in the corner while the adults conducted business. And each time he saw her, he would feel something twist in his chest, some combination of guilt and recognition, and a strange, uncomfortable pride. She was his daughter. He could never acknowledge her, could never claim her, but she was his. By 1847, Rose was 12 years old, and the resemblance to Henri had become too pronounced to ignore. Old Monsieur Mercier had died the previous year, and his estate was being managed by a nephew who had no particular loyalty to Henri Laval, and no reason to maintain the quiet arrangement that had protected Dinah and Rose. The nephew was consolidating the estate, selling off assets, and preparing to move to Mobile, where he had business interests. Several of the Belle Reve slaves were to be sold, and Rose was among them. When Henri learned of this, through business channels, through the network of information that connected planters and merchants across the South, he made a decision that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. He would buy Rose. He would bring her to Bellamont House. He told himself it was to protect her, to ensure she ended up in a good situation, rather than being sold to strangers. But there was something else driving the decision, something darker and more complicated. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was a twisted desire to keep his daughter close, to have her in his household where he could see her, even if he could never acknowledge who she was. Whatever his reasoning, Henri Laval set in motion the events that would destroy his marriage, his reputation, and ultimately his life. The transaction was handled through an intermediary, as such sensitive matters often were. In March of 1847, Henri arranged for a business associate named Charles Dupont to approach the Mercier nephew about purchasing several slaves, including a 12-year-old girl skilled in household work. The price was fair, $200, standard for a healthy young slave with house training. The paperwork was unremarkable. Just another bill of sale in a society where such documents were produced by the thousands every year. Dinah was not included in the sale. The separation of mother and daughter was common enough in the slave trade to raise no particular comment, though those who witnessed Dinah's grief that day would remember it for years. She held Rose until the last possible moment, whispering something in her ear that no one else could hear. Later, those who had been present would wonder what Dinah had told her daughter in those final moments. A warning, a blessing, instructions for survival. Whatever the words were, Rose carried them with her when she was loaded into the wagon that would take her to Louisiana. The journey from Belle Reve to Belmont House took 4 days. Rose traveled with 3 other slaves who had been purchased by various buyers in the area, 2 field hands, and a woman who would work as a cook. They were chained together in the back of the wagon, given minimal food and water, and allowed to sleep on the ground at night. It was Rose's first experience of the brutal reality of being sold, of being transported like livestock from one owner to another. She had lived her entire life at Belle Reve, had known only one place, one community. Now she was being taken to a strange household, to work for people she had never met, for reasons she didn't understand. Rose arrived at Belmont House on April 10th, 4 days before the Laval's 9th wedding anniversary. The plantation was larger and grander than Belle Reve, with a main house that seemed enormous to Rose's eyes. 2 stories of white-painted wood with tall columns and wide galleries, surrounded by gardens and outbuildings. The quarters where the slaves lived were set back from the main house, a row of small cabins that housed the 40-some people who worked the cotton fields and maintained the household. Rose was kept in the quarters initially, given time to adjust to her new surroundings. The other house slaves studied her with curiosity and some suspicion. New slaves always disrupted the established hierarchy, and Rose was particularly puzzling. She was too light-skinned, too carefully selected. And there was something about the way Monsieur Laval had looked at her when she arrived, a look that the older slaves recognized and that made them uneasy. An elderly woman named Judith, who had worked at Belmont House for 30 years and served as the unofficial leader of the house slaves, took Rose aside on her second day. They were in the kitchen, where Rose was being taught the layout and routines of the household. "Child," Judith said quietly, making sure no one else was close enough to hear, "you need to understand something. You're in a dangerous position here. I don't know what the master's thinking, bringing you here, but it's not good. You keep your head down, you do your work, and you don't give Madame any reason to notice you more than necessary. You understand?" Rose nodded, though she didn't fully understand. She was 12 years old, had been torn from her mother and everything she knew, and was trying simply to survive each day. The complexities of the situation she had been placed in were beyond her comprehension. On the morning of April 14th, Henri called Rose into the main house. It was early, before Celeste had risen, and the house was quiet except for the sounds of the kitchen staff preparing breakfast. Henri met Rose in the hallway outside his study, and for a long moment, he simply looked at her. In the morning light coming through the tall windows, the resemblance between them was striking. The same eyes, the same shape of face, the same way of holding themselves. Henri felt that familiar twist in his chest, that mixture of guilt and recognition. "You're to be a gift for Madame," he said finally, his voice formal, distant. "For our anniversary. You'll work directly under her supervision, helping with her wardrobe and personal needs. You'll be respectful, obedient, and discreet. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Rose said quietly, keeping her eyes down as Dinah had taught her. Henri wanted to say more. He wanted to ask about Dinah, about Rose's childhood at Belle Reve, about whether she was frightened or confused. He wanted to tell her that he was her father, that he had brought her here to protect her, that she would be safe in his household. But he said none of these things. To speak them would be to acknowledge a truth that could never be acknowledged, to create a crack in the carefully constructed facade of his respectable life. Instead, He simply nodded and called for Judith to take Rose away and prepare her for the presentation. Rose was dressed in a new cotton dress, pale blue with white trim, finer than anything she had ever worn. Her hair was arranged carefully, braided and pinned in the style that Celeste preferred for her house slaves. She was given a white apron to wear over the dress, marking her as part of the household staff. And then she was made to wait in the hallway while Henri went to fetch his wife. Celeste was in the morning room when Henri brought Rose to her. The anniversary breakfast had been laid out on the small table by the window, fine china with a delicate floral pattern, fresh flowers from the garden arranged in a crystal vase, all the markers of civilized domesticity. Celeste was dressed in a morning gown of pale yellow silk, her dark hair arranged in the elaborate style she favored. She was 38 years old, still beautiful in the severe way of women who have learned to use their appearance as a form of power. "My dear," Henri said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that had characterized their marriage for years. "I have an anniversary gift for you. This girl, Rose, has been trained in household work and personal service. I thought she might be useful to you, to help with your wardrobe and other needs." Celeste studied Rose with the practiced eye of a woman accustomed to evaluating property. She noted the girl's light complexion, the quality of her features, the new dress that was finer than what the other house slaves wore. She noted the way Henri stood slightly too close to the girl, the way his voice had a particular tone when he spoke about her. And then Celeste looked at Rose's face, really looked at it, and saw something that made her blood run cold. The girl had Henri's eyes, the same unusual shade of grey-green, the same shape, the same way of looking out at the world. It was unmistakable once you saw it, impossible to unsee. Celeste felt something crack inside her chest, some final illusion about her marriage shattering like the crystal vase on the table would shatter if she threw it against the wall. But Celeste had been trained since childhood in the art of maintaining appearances, of never showing emotion in public, of preserving dignity no matter what private pain she might be feeling. So she smiled, a cold, perfect smile, and nodded her acceptance. "How thoughtful of you, Henri," she said, her voice smooth as silk and just as cold. "I'm sure she'll be very useful. Rose, you may go to the kitchen and help with clearing the breakfast dishes. I'll call for you when I need you." Rose curtsied. Judith had taught her that the night before, and fled from the room. She could feel the tension between Monsieur and Madame Laval, could sense that something terrible was happening even if she didn't understand what it was. She went to the kitchen and stood in the corner, trembling, while the other slaves exchanged knowing looks. Henri and Celeste were left alone in the morning room. They sat down to their anniversary breakfast, and for several minutes, neither of them spoke. Henri ate mechanically, not tasting the food. Celeste sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed. Finally, Henri said, "She's a good worker." The Mercier family spoke highly of her training. "The Mercier family," Celeste repeated softly. "In Mississippi, where you spent so much time before we were married." Henri's hand froze halfway to his mouth. He set down his fork carefully. "Yes, I did business with them for several years. And this girl," Celeste continued, her voice still soft, still perfectly controlled. "She was born there. At the Mercier plantation?" "I believe so." "How old is she?" 12. Celeste did the mathematics in her head. 12 years old, born in 1835. Henri had been doing business with the Mercier family in 1834 and 1835 before their marriage, before he had even begun courting her. "She has your eyes," Celeste said finally, looking directly at her husband. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Henri said nothing. What could he say? Denial would be insulting to both of them. Admission would force them both to confront a truth that their society had carefully constructed elaborate fictions to avoid confronting. "I see," Celeste said after a long silence. She stood up, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled only slightly. "Thank you for the anniversary gift, Henri. It's very illuminating." She walked out of the morning room with her head high, her back straight, every inch the aristocratic lady she had been raised to be. But inside, Celeste Dufresne-Laval was calculating, planning and nursing a rage that would poison everything it touched for the next 15 years. The first weeks of Rose's life at Belmont House established patterns that would persist for years. She was assigned to work directly under Celeste's supervision, which meant she was constantly in the mistress's presence. She helped Celeste dress in the morning, arranged her hair, maintained her wardrobe, served her meals when she took them in her room, and attended to countless small tasks throughout the day. Celeste was never cruel in any obvious way. There were no beatings, no deprivations of food, nothing that would have been remarked upon by visitors or other staff. But there was a coldness in how Celeste treated Rose, a particular quality of attention that felt more like surveillance than supervision. She watched Rose constantly, studied her face, compared her features to Henri's, and she found ways to remind Rose, subtly but constantly, of her powerlessness. Rose would be made to stand for hours holding items, while Celeste decided whether to use them: a shawl, a book, a fan. She would be sent to fetch something from another room, only to be told when she returned that it was the wrong item, that she should have known better, that she needed to pay more attention. She would be given tasks that were impossible to complete perfectly: mending linens with stitches so small they could barely be seen, polishing silver until it showed no fingerprints whatsoever, arranging flowers in vases according to specifications that changed each time Rose thought she had understood them. It was work designed not for productivity, but for control, for the constant reinforcement of Rose's powerlessness and Celeste's absolute authority. And it was effective. Within a month, Rose had learned to move through the house like a ghost, silent and invisible, trying desperately not to draw any more attention than necessary. The other slaves at Belmont House understood the situation, or at least understood enough to know that Rose occupied a strange and dangerous position. Some pitied her. Judith, the elderly woman who had tried to warn Rose on her first day, would sometimes slip her extra food or a kind word when Celeste wasn't watching. But others resented Rose for the attention she received, even if that attention was poisonous. She was a house slave, which already set her apart from the field workers. She worked directly for Madame, which gave her a certain status. And there was the matter of her light skin, her obvious connection to the master, the special treatment she had received even before arriving at Belmont House. Rose had no real friends in the quarters, no confidants. She was isolated by the very secret that defined her existence, trapped between two worlds and belonging fully to neither. Meanwhile, Celeste had begun her investigation. She was a methodical woman, patient and thorough. She understood that suspicion was not enough. She needed confirmation, needed to know exactly what had happened between Henri and this girl's mother, needed to understand the full scope of her husband's betrayal. She began by writing letters, casual correspondence with acquaintances in Mississippi, women she had met during visits to New Orleans, wives of planters who did business with Henri. The letters were full of the usual social pleasantries, but they also contained careful questions. Did you know the Mercier family? Such a tragedy about old Monsieur Mercier's death. I understand they've sold several of their people recently. There was a girl, Rose, who came to work for us, such a well-trained young thing. Do you know anything about her background? The responses came slowly over the summer of 1847. Most contained nothing useful, just vague pleasantries and expressions of sympathy for the Mercier family's losses. But then, in August, a letter arrived from a woman named Madame Rousseau, whose husband owned a plantation neighboring Belle Rive. The letter was full of gossip, as Madame Rousseau's letters always were. She wrote about the weather, about the cotton crop, about various social events and scandals. And then, almost as an afterthought, she wrote, "You mentioned the girl Rose who came to work for you. Yes, I remember her mother, Dinah, such a skilled seamstress. There was some talk years ago about the circumstances of Rose's birth. You know how people gossip. Your husband was a frequent visitor at Belle Rive in those days, before your marriage, of course. I'm sure it's nothing, just the usual plantation rumors, but the girl does have rather distinctive features, doesn't she? Celeste read the letter 3 times, standing by the window in her bedroom where the afternoon light fell across the page. The phrasing was delicate, the implications carefully veiled, but the message was clear enough. Her suspicions were confirmed. Rose was Henri's daughter, born of a relationship with an enslaved woman during his bachelor years in Mississippi. That evening, Celeste confronted Henri in his study. It was after dinner and the house was quiet. She closed the door behind her and stood in front of his desk, the letter from Madame Rousseau in her hand. "I know," she said simply. Henri looked up from the ledger he had been reviewing. He saw the letter, saw the expression on his wife's face, and understood immediately what she meant. "Celeste," he began. "Don't," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "Don't insult me with denials or explanations. I know what you did. I know who that girl is, and I know that you brought her into this house, into my household, as some sort of, what, penance? Attempt at protection? A way to keep your bastard daughter close while maintaining your respectable facade?" Henri stood up, his face flushing. "It wasn't like that. I was trying to help her. The Mercier estate was being sold, and she would have been sent to God knows where. I thought if I brought her here—" "You thought you could have it both ways," Celeste said coldly. "You thought you could keep your daughter as your slave, could see her every day, could feel better about yourself for protecting her, all while never having to actually acknowledge what you'd done or face any real consequences for it. And you thought I would never know, or that if I did know I would simply accept it like a good wife and say nothing. What do you want me to do?" Henri asked, his voice tired. "She's here now, she's a child. Whatever happened with her mother was 12 years ago, before we were married. I can't change the past." "No," Celeste agreed, "but you can change the present. You can sell her, send her away, remove this reminder of your indiscretion from my house." Henri shook his head. "I won't do that. She's safe here. She's being treated well. To sell her now would be to condemn her to who knows what kind of situation." "How noble of you," Celeste said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "How very noble to keep your slave daughter in your household, where you can feel virtuous about protecting her while she serves your wife. Do you not see how twisted this is? How insulting it is to me to have to look at her every day, to see your eyes looking back at me from her face." "I'm sorry," Henri said quietly. "I'm sorry for all of it, but I won't sell her. That's final." Celeste stared at her husband for a long moment. Then she smiled, a cold, terrible smile that made Henri take a step back. "Very well," she said. "She stays. But understand this, Henri. She is my property now. You gave her to me as a gift, remember? That means I decide how she's treated, what work she does, what happens to her. You've absolved yourself of responsibility by making her mine. So she's mine, and you will not interfere with how I choose to manage my own property." She turned and walked out of the study, leaving Henri standing alone among his ledgers and account books, surrounded by all the evidence of his wealth and success, and feeling more powerless than he had ever felt in his life. From that night forward, the dynamic at Bellamont House shifted into something darker. Celeste's treatment of Rose became more pointed, more deliberately cruel in small ways. The tasks became more tedious, the standards more impossible, the criticism more constant, and Henri, bound by his own words and his own guilt, could do nothing but watch. The years between 1847 and 1852 saw Rose grow from a frightened child into a young woman trapped in an impossible situation. She understood by now, through overheard conversations and the way Celeste looked at her, that Henri was her father. But this knowledge brought no comfort, no protection. If anything, it made her position more precarious. Rose learned to read Celeste's moods, to anticipate her needs, to make herself as invisible as possible. She learned which rooms to avoid when Madame was in a particularly dark mood, which tasks were most likely to meet with approval, which silences were safest. It was an education in survival, in navigating a world where she had no power and no protection. Henri avoided Rose as much as possible. When he did encounter her in the house, his expression was a mixture of guilt and something else. Perhaps regret, perhaps resentment that she existed as a living reminder of his past indiscretion and present moral failure. He never spoke to her directly if he could avoid it, never acknowledged the connection between them. To do so would be to admit the truth, and admission was impossible. But there were moments when the facade cracked slightly. Once, when Rose was 14, she was carrying a heavy tray of dishes from the dining room to the kitchen when she stumbled on the stairs. The tray fell, and china shattered across the floor. Rose stood frozen, knowing that such carelessness would result in punishment, probably being denied dinner, possibly being whipped by the overseer if Celeste was angry enough. Henri had been in the hallway and had seen the accident. He saw Rose's face, saw the fear there, and something in him broke. He called for Judith to clean up the mess and told Rose to go to the kitchen. When Celeste came to investigate the noise and demanded to know who was responsible, Henri said it had been one of the other slaves, that the matter had been dealt with, that Celeste needn't concern herself. It was a small protection, a small lie, but it was the only thing Henri could offer. And Rose, standing in the kitchen and listening to her father lie to protect her, felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief. He was her father, and he cared enough to lie for her. But he didn't care enough to free her, to acknowledge her, to give her any real protection or any real life. As Rose grew older, new dangers emerged. She was becoming a young woman, and in the world of southern plantations, that meant she was becoming vulnerable in new ways. The male slaves at Bellamont House generally left her alone. She was too closely associated with the master and mistress, too dangerous to approach. But there were visitors to the plantation, business associates of Henri's who would sometimes stay for days or weeks. And there were the white men who worked on the property, the overseer, the bookkeeper, the various tradesmen who came and went. Rose learned to avoid being alone with any of them, learned to keep to the main house where Celeste's presence offered a strange kind of protection. Celeste might hate her, might make her life miserable in countless small ways, but she also had a vested interest in maintaining control over her household and her property. No one would touch Rose without Celeste's permission, and Celeste was not inclined to grant that permission. But in 1850, when Rose was 15, the situation changed. Henri hired a new overseer named Thomas Garrett to manage the field operations at Bellamont. Garrett was a hard man, typical of his profession. He had worked on plantations across Louisiana and Mississippi, had a reputation for maintaining discipline and maximizing productivity. He was also a man who believed that his position gave him certain privileges, including access to enslaved women. Garrett noticed Rose almost immediately. She was beautiful in a way that was impossible to ignore. Light-skinned, delicate features, a grace in how she moved that set her apart from the other slaves. And there was something else about her, something in her bearing that suggested she was different, special, connected to the master's household in some significant way. Garrett began to pay attention to Rose, finding excuses to be near the main house, making comments that started as seemingly innocent observations and gradually became more pointed. He would compliment her appearance, ask her questions about her work, suggest that she must get lonely working in the big house all day. Rose understood the danger immediately. She had seen what happened to slave women who caught the attention of white men, had heard the stories whispered in the quarters. She tried to avoid Garrett, but it was difficult. He had legitimate reasons to be around the main house. He needed to report to Henri about the field operations, to coordinate with the house staff about supplies and schedules. And he was clever about his pursuit, never doing anything obvious enough to be reported, never crossing the line in ways that could be clearly documented. Rose finally worked up the courage to mention Garrett's behavior to Celeste. It was a desperate move, but she hoped that the mistress might intervene, if only to protect her property. She waited until she was helping Celeste dress one morning when they were alone in the bedroom. "Madame," Rose said quietly, her voice shaking, I need to tell you something. The overseer, Monsieur Garrett, he's been paying attention to me, saying things. I'm afraid of what he might do." Celeste continued fastening her dress, not looking at Rose. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, finally, she turned and looked at the girl with cold eyes. "You will manage your own difficulties," Celeste said flatly. "Do not bring such matters to me again. You are not a child anymore, Rose. You should be capable of handling the attention of men without running to me for protection." Rose felt something die inside her chest. She had known that Celeste hated her, had known that she could expect no kindness from the woman who owned her. But she had hoped, desperately, that Celeste's sense of property rights, her desire to maintain control over her household, would offer some protection. Instead, Celeste was making it clear that Rose was on her own, that whatever happened to her was her own problem. "Yes, madame," Rose whispered, and said nothing more. The rejection was devastating, but it also clarified Rose's situation with brutal honesty. She was truly alone. Henri wouldn't protect her because to do so would be to acknowledge their relationship. Celeste wouldn't protect her because she wanted Rose to suffer. The other slaves couldn't protect her because they had no power. Rose was trapped in a situation where she was vulnerable to any white man who decided to take an interest in her, with no recourse and no hope of intervention. She began to plan. It was a desperate, probably hopeless plan, but it was all she had. She would save every penny she could get her hands on, tips from visitors, coins found in the laundry, anything. She would learn everything she could about the world beyond Bellamont House, about routes north, about people who might help escaped slaves. And when the time was right, when she had enough resources and enough knowledge, she would run. It was a fantasy, really. The chances of a young enslaved woman successfully escaping from Louisiana to freedom in the North were infinitesimal. The patrols were constant, the penalties for helping runaways were severe, and the distances were vast. But the fantasy gave Rose something to hold on to, some sense of agency in a life where she had none. The summer of 1852 brought the crisis that would accelerate the tragedy unfolding at Bellamont House. Thomas Garrett's attention to Rose had become increasingly aggressive over the past 2 years. He had progressed from comments to touches, a hand on her arm when she passed him in the yard, fingers brushing against hers when she handed him something, a grip on her shoulder that lasted too long. Rose had been doing everything in her power to avoid being alone with him. But on a humid afternoon in July, her luck ran out. She was working in the laundry house behind the main building, a small structure where the household's linens were washed and ironed. It was hot, exhausting work, and Rose was alone. The other woman who usually worked with her was sick, confined to the quarters with a fever. Rose was bent over the washing tub, scrubbing at a stained tablecloth, when she heard the door open behind her. She turned and saw Thomas Garrett standing in the doorway, blocking the only exit. He was smiling, but it was not a kind smile. "Afternoon, Rose," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Thought I'd come see if you needed any help with that heavy work." "No, thank you, sir," Rose said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her throat. "I'm managing fine." "Now that's not very friendly," Garrett said, moving closer. "I've been trying to be nice to you for 2 years now, and you just keep running away. That's not polite, Rose. That's not respectful." Rose backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The laundry house was small, and Garrett was between her and the door. She looked around desperately for something she could use as a weapon, but there was nothing, just tubs of water and piles of linens. "Please, sir," she said, hating the pleading tone in her voice, but unable to stop it. "Please, just let me finish my work. Madame will be angry if the laundry isn't done." "Madame doesn't need to know about this," Garrett said, reaching for her. "This can be our little secret." What happened next happened fast. Garrett grabbed Rose's arm, pulling her toward him. Rose tried to pull away, and he slapped her, hard enough to make her ears ring. She stumbled backward, hit the edge of the washing tub, and fell. Garrett was on her immediately, his weight pinning her down, his hands tearing at her dress. Rose fought. She scratched at his face, tried to scream, kicked and twisted, and did everything she could to get away. But Garrett was stronger, and he was angry now. Angry that she was resisting, angry that she wasn't submitting quietly like he thought she should. The struggle lasted several minutes, though to Rose it felt like hours. At some point she managed to grab a wooden washing paddle and hit Garrett across the side of the head with it. He reeled back, cursing, and Rose scrambled to her feet and ran for the door. She burst out of the laundry house and ran toward the main house, her dress torn, her face bruised and bleeding from where Garrett had hit her. She could hear him behind her, shouting, but she didn't stop. She ran up the back stairs and into the house, past the shocked kitchen staff, and straight to Henri's study. Henri was at his desk when Rose burst in without knocking, a breach of protocol that would normally have resulted in immediate punishment. He looked up, startled, and then saw her condition, the torn dress, the bruises, the terror in her eyes. "What happened?" he demanded, standing up. Rose stood before him, trembling, and said the words she had never been permitted to say, the words that had been forbidden for 7 years. "You're my father. Please help me." The silence that followed was absolute. Henri stared at his daughter, and in that moment he could not deny that's what she was, standing before him with his own eyes looking back at him in desperate appeal. For a long moment, something like recognition, perhaps even compassion, flickered across his face. He saw her not as property, not as a problem to be managed, but as his child, his daughter, a human being who needed his protection. Then Celeste appeared in the doorway. She had heard the commotion, had followed Rose through the house. She stood there perfectly composed despite the chaos, and took in the scene. Rose in her torn dress, Henri standing behind his desk with an expression of anguish on his face, the words that had just been spoken hanging in the air between them. "Get out," Celeste said to Rose, her voice like ice. "Go to your quarters and stay there. Do not come back to this house until you are sent for." Rose looked at Henri, hoping for some sign that he would contradict his wife, that he would offer the protection she had begged for. But Henri said nothing. He stood there, frozen, caught between his guilt and his cowardice, unable to act. Rose fled. She ran to the quarters, to the small cabin she shared with 3 other house slaves, and collapsed on her pallet. The other women tried to comfort her, but Rose was beyond comfort. She had finally spoken the truth, had finally claimed her father, and he had done nothing. He had stood there and let Celeste send her away, had chosen his wife and his reputation over his daughter's safety. Henri and Celeste were left alone in the study for another confrontation, this one more explosive than any that had come before. The house slaves who worked nearby heard raised voices, heard something shatter, a glass or vase thrown against a wall. The argument lasted for over an hour, conducted in a mixture of English and French, with accusations and recriminations that had been building for 5 years finally erupting. When Celeste emerged, her face was composed but pale, her hands shaking slightly as she called for Judith, the head house slave. "Send for the sheriff," Celeste said, her voice perfectly controlled. "We've had a theft." Judith stared at her mistress, understanding immediately what was happening. "Madame," she began. "Now," Celeste interrupted. "Send for the sheriff now." The accusation was simple and devastating. Rose had stolen a piece of jewelry from Celeste's room, a gold brooch that had belonged to Celeste's mother. It was a valuable piece, both monetarily and sentimentally, and its theft was a serious crime. The brooch was found in Rose's belongings in the quarters, planted there by Celeste herself, though of course there was no way to prove that. The other slaves knew immediately that Rose was being framed, that this was Celeste's revenge for the scene in Henri's study, for Rose's claim of kinship, for 7 years of humiliation and rage. But there was nothing they could do. To speak up would be to invite punishment themselves, and their testimony wouldn't be believed anyway. Slaves could not testify against white people in Louisiana courts. Rose was taken to the parish jail that evening to await trial. She went quietly, understanding that resistance would only make things worse. As she was being led away, she looked back at the main house and saw Henri standing at the window of his study, watching. Their eyes met for a moment, and Rose saw something in her father's face that might have been grief or might have been guilt. Then he turned away, and Rose was taken to jail. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Bellamont House intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The trial of Rose for theft was scheduled for August 3rd, 1852, 3 weeks after her arrest. She spent those weeks in the parish jail, a small stone building that held perhaps a dozen prisoners at any given time. The conditions were harsh. She was kept in a cell with 2 other women, given minimal food and water, and allowed outside only for brief periods each day. But the physical hardship was nothing compared to the psychological torment of knowing that she was being punished not for anything she had done, but simply for existing, for being the living evidence of Henri Laval's past and Céleste Laval's humiliation. Henri visited the jail once during those 3 weeks. He came late at night, when few people would see him, and asked to speak with Rose privately. The jailer, who knew Henri and depended on his goodwill for various business matters, allowed it. Father and daughter sat across from each other in the small visiting room, separated by a wooden table. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Henri looked at Rose, at her bruised face, her thin frame, the hopelessness in her eyes, and felt shame so profound it was almost physical. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm sorry for all of it. For bringing you here, for not protecting you, for being too weak to do what I should have done." Rose said nothing. What was there to say? Sorry didn't change anything. Sorry didn't free her from jail, didn't erase the past 7 years, didn't give her back her mother or her childhood or any hope for a future. The trial, Henri continued, his voice low. "Céleste is determined to see you convicted. She wants you sent to the state prison or sold out of state, or I don't know what she wants exactly. Revenge, I suppose, for everything." "And what do you want?" Rose asked, speaking for the first time. Her voice was flat, emotionless. Henri looked at his hands. "I want to make this right, but I don't know how. If I testify that you didn't steal the brooch, Céleste will know I'm lying to protect you. It will confirm everything she suspects, will make the situation worse. But if I don't testify, you'll be convicted. There's no evidence in your favor, no witnesses who can speak for you. So I'm going to be convicted," Rose said, "and you're going to let it happen, because protecting me would be inconvenient for you. It's not that simple." "Yes, it is," Rose interrupted, her voice suddenly fierce. "It's exactly that simple. You could free me. You could acknowledge me as your daughter and free me. You have that power. But you won't, because it would cost you too much. Your reputation, your marriage, your position in society. So instead, you'll let me be convicted of a crime I didn't commit, and you'll tell yourself it's complicated, that there's nothing you can do." Henri had no answer to that, because Rose was right. He had the power to free her, to acknowledge her, to give her a life. But he wouldn't, because the cost to himself was too high. He was a coward, and they both knew it. He left the jail that night without saying anything more, and Rose was left alone with the knowledge that her father had chosen his comfort over her freedom, had chosen his reputation over her life. The trial took place on a hot August morning in the parish courthouse. It was a brief proceeding, as such trials typically were when the accused was enslaved and the accuser was white and wealthy. The courthouse was full. Trials were public entertainment, and a case involving the prominent Laval family had drawn a crowd. Céleste testified first. She was composed, dignified, every inch the wronged lady. She described the brooch, a gold piece with pearls and a small ruby, a gift from her mother on her wedding day of great sentimental value. She described discovering it missing from her jewelry box, searching the house, and finally finding it hidden in Rose's belongings in the quarters. She spoke with just the right amount of emotion, enough to seem genuinely hurt, not so much as to seem hysterical or unreliable. The sheriff testified next, corroborating Céleste's story. He had been called to Belmont House, had been shown the missing brooch, had accompanied Madame Laval to the quarters where the brooch had been found in Rose's possession. It was a clear case of theft, he said. The evidence was undeniable. Rose was not permitted to testify in her own defense. Louisiana law prohibited slaves from testifying against white people. Her court-appointed attorney, a young man who had been practicing law for less than a year and who clearly wanted to be anywhere but in this courtroom, made a perfunctory argument that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no proof Rose had actually taken the brooch, but his heart wasn't in it, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The judge was preparing to deliver the inevitable guilty verdict when Henri Laval stood up in the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rough, "I wish to address the court." The room fell silent. Celeste turned to stare at her husband, her face suddenly alert with alarm. She knew that tone in his voice, knew that something was about to break. She half rose from her seat as if to stop him, but it was too late. Henri walked to the front of the courtroom. He looked at Rose, standing in the dock with her hands bound, her face showing no expression because she had learned long ago that showing emotion was dangerous. He looked at his wife, sitting rigid in her seat, her eyes promising consequences. He looked at the judge, at the crowd of spectators, at all the people who represented the society he had worked so hard to be accepted by. And then he made his choice. "The girl is innocent," Henri said clearly. "The brooch was not stolen. It was misplaced. My wife was mistaken." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge banged his gavel for silence. Celeste had gone white, then red, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles showed pale. "Monsieur Laval," the judge said carefully, "are you certain? This is a serious accusation to retract. Are you saying that your wife has lied to this court?" Henri hesitated. He could feel Celeste's eyes on him, could feel the weight of what he was doing. If he continued, if he publicly contradicted his wife, he would be humiliating her in front of the entire parish. Their marriage would be destroyed. His reputation would be damaged. People would ask questions about why he was so determined to protect this particular slave girl. But if he didn't continue, Rose would be convicted. She would be sent to the state prison, or sold to a chain gang, or transported to the deep south, where the conditions were even harsher than in Louisiana. She would suffer, possibly die, because of his cowardice. Henri thought of the night he had visited Rose in jail, of the way she had looked at him with his own eyes and told him he was choosing his comfort over her freedom. He thought of Dinah, Rose's mother, whom he had used and abandoned. He thought of all the choices he had made, all the ways he had failed to be the man he should have been. "I am saying," Henri said slowly, "that there has been a misunderstanding. The brooch was not stolen. I asked the court to dismiss the charges and release the girl to my custody." The judge looked at Celeste, who sat frozen in her seat, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. He looked at Henri, who stood with his shoulders back and his head high, looking more determined than anyone had seen him look in years. And the judge, who was a practical man and who understood that he was witnessing the public dissolution of one of the parish's most prominent marriages, made the only decision he could make. "The charges are dismissed," he said, banging his gavel. "The defendant is released." Rose was unbound and released from the dock. She stood there for a moment, not quite believing what had happened, not quite trusting that she was actually free. Then Henri walked over to her and said quietly, "Come with me." They walked out of the courthouse together, father and daughter, while the crowd whispered and stared. Celeste remained in her seat, too shocked and too angry to move. She had been publicly contradicted by her husband, had been made to look like a liar or a fool, had lost the revenge she had been planning for weeks. The humiliation was complete. The ride back to Belmont House was silent. Rose sat in the back of the carriage, Henri and Celeste in the front, the space between them crackling with unspoken rage. When they arrived, Celeste went immediately to her room and locked the door. Henri went to his study, and Rose was sent to the quarters, where the other slaves looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear, understanding that something fundamental had shifted but not knowing what would come next. What came next arrived 3 days later in the form of a bill of sale and a letter. Henri had spent those 3 days in his study, drinking brandy and writing letters and making arrangements. He had not spoken to Celeste, who remained locked in her room, refusing food and refusing to see anyone. He had not spoken to Rose, who remained in the quarters, waiting for whatever would happen next. On the 3rd day, Henri called Rose to his study. She came reluctantly, still not trusting that the situation had truly changed, still expecting some new punishment or betrayal. Henri was standing by the window when she entered, looking out at the cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. He didn't turn around when she came in. "I've arranged for you to be sold," he said without preamble, "to a family in Texas, the Harpers. They're respectable people, known to treat their slaves reasonably well. You'll leave tomorrow." Rose felt something cold settle in her stomach. So this was it. She had been freed from jail only to be sold away, sent to strangers in a distant state. It was better than prison, she supposed, but it was still exile, still punishment. "I understand," she said quietly. "No," Henri said, finally turning to look at her. "You don't understand. The sale it's a fiction. The Harpers are abolitionists. They'll take you to Texas, and then they'll help you get to Mexico. From there you can make your way north, to the free states, or you can stay in Mexico. You'll be free, Rose. Truly free." Rose stared at her father, not quite believing what she was hearing. "Free?" "Yes," Henri said. He reached into his desk and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This is for you. $200 in gold coins. It's the price I paid for you 5 years ago. It's not enough, not nearly enough to make up for everything, but it's what I can give you. Use it to start your life wherever you decide to go." He held out the pouch, and Rose took it with trembling hands. She opened it and saw the gold coins gleaming inside, more money than she had ever seen in her life. "There's also this," Henri said, handing her a sealed letter. "It's a letter of manumission, signed and notarized. It says that you've been freed by your owner. It's not entirely legal. Technically, Celeste owns you, not me, and she hasn't signed anything. But it should be enough to protect you if you're questioned, and once you're out of Louisiana, it won't matter anyway." Rose looked at the letter, at the gold, at her father's face. She saw the guilt there, the shame, the desperate need to believe that this gesture could somehow make up for 7 years of cowardice and cruelty. "Why now?" she asked. "Why are you doing this now after all this time?" Henri was silent for a long moment. "Because I saw you in that courtroom," he said finally. "I saw what I had done to you, what I had allowed to be done to you, and I realized that if I didn't act then, if I let you be convicted and sent away, I would never be able to live with myself. I've made a lot of mistakes, Rose. I've been weak and selfish and cowardly, but I can do this one thing. I can give you your freedom." "What about Madame?" Rose asked. "What will she do when she finds out?" "I don't know," Henri admitted. "She'll be furious. She may leave me, may divorce me, may make my life hell. But that's my problem, not yours. You'll be gone, and you'll be free, and that's what matters." Rose looked at her father for a long moment. She thought about everything that had happened, about her mother left behind in Mississippi, about 7 years of servitude and humiliation, about all the ways Henri had failed her. And she thought about this moment, about the fact that he was finally doing the right thing, even if it was too late to undo all the harm that had been done. "Thank you," she said quietly. It wasn't forgiveness. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that he was trying, in his inadequate way, to make amends. Henri nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more, wanted to embrace her or offer some final words of wisdom or apology. But he didn't. The distance between them was too great, the damage too profound. Instead, he simply said, "The Harpers will be here tomorrow morning. Be ready." Rose left the study and returned to the quarters. She told no one about the conversation, about the plan. about the gold and the letter hidden in her dress. She simply packed her few belongings and waited for morning. The Harpers arrived at dawn. They were a middle-aged couple, quiet and serious, who conducted their business with Henri quickly and efficiently. The bill of sale was signed, the money exchanged, and Rose was loaded into their wagon along with some supplies for the journey. As they pulled away from Belmont House, Rose looked back one last time at the place that had been her prison for 7 years. She saw Henri standing on the gallery watching her leave. Their eyes met across the distance, and Rose raised her hand in a small gesture. Not quite a wave, not quite a farewell, but an acknowledgement. Henri raised his hand in return. Then the wagon turned onto the road, and Belmont House disappeared from view. The journey to Texas took 2 weeks. The Harpers were kind to Rose, treating her not as property, but as a person. They explained their plan. They would take her to their home near the Texas-Mexico border, and from there, they would help her cross into Mexico. They had contacts there, people who could help her establish herself, find work, build a life. Rose listened to all of this with a sense of unreality. Freedom had been an abstract concept for so long, a fantasy she barely allowed herself to imagine. Now it was becoming real, and she didn't quite know how to process it. They reached the Harpers' home in late August. It was a small ranch, isolated and quiet, far from the major towns and the eyes of authorities. The Harpers gave Rose a room, fed her, and treated her with a kindness she had almost forgotten existed. And after a few days of rest, they helped her cross the border into Mexico. Rose spent the next year in a small town in northern Mexico, working as a seamstress and learning Spanish. She used Henri's gold carefully, saving most of it while she established herself. And in 1853 she made the decision to continue north, to the United States, to the free states where slavery was illegal. The journey was long and dangerous. Rose traveled with a group of other former slaves, following the routes and safe houses of the Underground Railroad. She worked her way through Texas, through the Indian Territory, through Kansas and Missouri. She saw things that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Slave catchers, bounty hunters, the constant fear of being captured and returned to bondage. But she also saw kindness. She met people, both black and white, who risked their own safety to help escaped slaves. She stayed in homes where families hid runaways in cellars and attics, where food and clothing were provided without expectation of payment, where strangers became allies in the fight for freedom. Rose finally reached Illinois in the spring of 1854, nearly 2 years after leaving Belmont House. She settled in a small town with a community of free blacks and former slaves, people who had made similar journeys and who understood what she had survived. She used the last of Henri's gold to buy a small piece of land and set up a dressmaking business. Over the next few years, Rose built a life. She married a man named James, a former slave from Kentucky who had escaped to freedom 5 years before. They had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son. Rose taught her daughters to read and write, skills that had been forbidden to her for most of her life. She taught them to sew, passing on the skills her mother had taught her. And she taught them to be proud, to hold their heads high, to never accept that they were less than anyone else. Rose never returned to Louisiana. She never spoke of Henri Laval or Celeste or Belmont House. When her children asked about her past, she would say only that she had been born in Mississippi and had come north as a young woman. The details, she said, were not important. What mattered was the life she had built, the freedom she had claimed, the future she had secured for her descendants. But she kept the leather pouch that Henri had given her, even after the gold was spent. And she kept the letter of manumission, carefully preserved in a wooden box. She never showed these things to anyone, but she kept them, perhaps as a reminder of where she had come from, or perhaps as evidence that her freedom had been earned, not given. Rose lived until 1903, dying at the age of 68, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She had seen the Civil War end slavery, had seen Reconstruction and its failures, had seen the rise of Jim Crow and the continued struggle for true equality. But she had also seen her children grow up free, had seen them educated and employed, had seen them build lives that would have been impossible for her generation. At her funeral, her eldest daughter spoke about Rose's strength, her resilience, her determination to build a better life for her family. But she didn't speak about Rose's past, because she didn't know it. The story of Belmont House, of Henri and Céleste Laval, of the 7 years Rose had spent as a slave in her father's household, all of that remained buried, a secret Rose had taken to her grave. The aftermath of Rose's departure destroyed what remained of the Laval marriage. Céleste never forgave Henri for his public humiliation of her in the courtroom, and she never forgave him for freeing Rose. When she discovered that Rose had been sold to abolitionists, that the sale had been a fiction designed to free her, Céleste's rage was absolute. She remained at Belmont House. Divorce was unthinkable for a woman of her position. But she and Henri became strangers living in the same building. They took meals separately, maintained separate social circles, spoke only when absolutely necessary. Céleste threw herself into managing the household and the plantation's social obligations, maintaining her position in New Orleans society through sheer force of will and careful attention to propriety. But she was a changed woman, harder and colder than before, with a bitterness that everyone could see, but no one dared mention. Henri's health declined rapidly after 1852. Whether from guilt, stress, or simply the weight of his choices, he aged dramatically. He continued to manage his business affairs, but his heart wasn't in it. He drank more, slept less, and spent long hours in his study staring at nothing. The other planters noticed the change, whispered about it, speculated about what had happened between the Lavals. But no one knew the full story, and Henri never spoke of it. By 1855, Henri was a shadow of the confident young man who had once built a cotton empire. His hands shook, his face was gaunt, and he moved through his days like a ghost. The doctor who examined him said there was nothing physically wrong, that his symptoms were the result of nervous exhaustion and melancholia. But Henri knew better. He was dying of guilt, of shame, of the knowledge that he had spent most of his life being a coward. Henri Laval died in the spring of 1856, at the age of 51. The official cause of death was listed as a failure of the heart, which was more accurate than the doctor knew. He was buried in the family plot in New Orleans, with a funeral attended by all the prominent families of Louisiana society. Céleste stood at the graveside in black silk, her face composed, accepting condolences with grace and dignity. No one would have guessed that she felt nothing but relief that her husband was finally gone. Céleste inherited everything: the plantation, the slaves, the investments, all of Henri's considerable wealth. She managed it all with the same cold efficiency she had always displayed, but she became increasingly reclusive. The social position she had guarded so carefully seemed to matter less to her after Henri's death. She was seen less frequently in New Orleans, spent more time alone in the house that had been the stage for so much quiet tragedy. The Civil War came in 1861, and Belmont House, like all the plantations of the South, was caught up in the chaos. Céleste's wealth was largely in Confederate bonds and currency, which became worthless when the South lost. The slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, and many of them left Belmont House immediately, heading north or to the cities in search of new lives. Judith, the elderly woman who had tried to protect Rose years before, was among those who left. She went to New Orleans and lived there until her death in 1870, working as a paid seamstress and never speaking of her years at Belmont House. Céleste struggled to maintain the plantation in the post-war years, but it was a losing battle. Without slave labor, without capital to pay workers, without the social and economic structures that had supported the plantation system, Belmont House fell into decline. The fields went unplanted, the buildings fell into disrepair, and Céleste herself became more and more isolated. In the years after the war, the few people who still visited Belmont House reported that Céleste had become strange. She was sometimes seen walking through the empty rooms, talking to herself in French. The freed slaves who had once worked there, now hired as paid servants, said she was arguing with ghosts, with Henri, with her own younger self, with the choices that had brought her to this lonely end. Céleste Dufresne-Laval died in 1871 at the age of 62. She was found in her bedroom, sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the overgrown gardens. She had been dead for several days before anyone discovered her. She left no heirs, no will, no instructions for her estate. Belmont House was sold to pay debts and eventually fell into ruin. By the early 20th century, it was nothing but a foundation and a few crumbling walls, another forgotten monument to the Old South and all its sins. The truth of what happened at Belmont House remained buried for generations. The records were scattered, the witnesses dead, the story forgotten. It was only in the 1970s when a historian researching plantation records in Louisiana came across the bill of sale for a 12-year-old girl named Rose, purchased by Henri Laval in 1847, that anyone began to piece together the story. The historian, a woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, noticed something odd about the dates and prices in the bill of sale. She began to investigate, tracking down other documents, the trial records from 1852, letters between Céleste and her correspondents in Mississippi, business records from the Mercier plantation. And eventually, through a genealogical research project, she made contact with Rose's descendants in Illinois. Rose's great-granddaughter, a woman named Eleanor, had inherited a wooden box that had belonged to Rose. Inside were the leather pouch, now empty, and the letter of manumission signed by Henri Laval. There was also a small notebook written in Rose's hand that contained a brief account of her life. Not a detailed memoir, but enough to confirm the story that Dr. Williams had been piecing together from the historical records. Dr. Williams published her findings in a scholarly journal in 1978, and the story of Rose and the Lavals became part of the historical record. It was taught in universities, discussed in books about slavery and the antebellum South, used as an example of the moral complexities and human tragedies that the institution of slavery created. But for Rose's descendants, it was more than just history. It was their family story, their heritage. Eleanor and her siblings traveled to Louisiana to see what remained of Belmont House. They stood among the ruins, among the crumbling foundations and overgrown gardens, and tried to imagine what their ancestor had endured there. She survived, Eleanor said, standing where the main house had once been. That's what matters. She survived, and she built a life, and she made sure her children had better. That's her legacy. And it was. Rose's legacy was not the suffering she had endured, but the strength she had shown, the life she had built, the freedom she had claimed. Her story was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the ability to survive impossible circumstances and emerge with dignity intact. This mystery shows us how the institution of slavery corrupted every human relationship it touched, how it made monsters of ordinary people and turned families into sites of unspeakable tragedy. It shows us the cost of cowardice, the price of choosing comfort over conscience. And it shows us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when every system and structure is designed to crush the human spirit, people can survive, can resist, can build lives of meaning and dignity. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Were Henri's final actions enough to redeem him, or was it too little, too late? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark stories from America's past. See you in the next video.